Hello and welcome to another edition of the Iain Dale All Talk podcast. I'm Iain Dale. Today we're going to talk to somebody who, if you're interested in politics or the political media, you are going to have seen him on your screens over the last 30 years a hell of a lot. He's just retired as, what were you, editor-at-large? Was that your title?
I don't like the retirement word. I have left the staff of Sky News.
Well, that's what I meant, retired from Sky News.
Actually,
it's Adam Boulton, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, indeed. I started, it's actually nearly 40 years. I think I first appeared on British screens in 1983, so I'm almost there. I was editor-at-large, which meant that I was doing a daily politics programme, plus going off and doing things that interested me, like French elections or German elections or American elections, or indeed the second impeachment of Donald Trump. So you can see it was all politics, but it gave me a wider brief than simply being stuck in Westminster, because I had been 25 years a political editor for Sky, and before that, about 5 years a political editor for TVAM. So although I come across as an establishment figure, I've actually been on two startups. I mean, working for them before they went on screen.
I always think of you as a bit of an insurgent figure, actually.
Oh, good. That's how I think of myself.
Oh, because, you've done writing for newspapers and all sorts of things, but you're predominantly known for your two TV roles, and both of those were startups. I mean, what an incredible privilege to be in at the start of something.
Yeah, I mean, amazing, really. And I was just lucky. I mean, I failed. I was at Oxford University, but I failed to get into all the graduate trainee schemes in newspapers and in television. And I did manage to switch from English literature, which I know at Oxford, to international relations. And on the advice of a friend whose father was a journalist, I went and did a master's degree in the United States, just as Ronald Reagan was being elected, in international relations. And then I came back just at the moment when British television was going through its second great expansion. In other words, breakfast television was starting, Channel 4 was starting, and there were jobs for supposedly bright young sparks back then, which is what TVM was. But what was fascinating was TVM, in a sense, was modelled on the traditional ITV of we'll give good chaps a franchise to do it. And we had David Frost and Michael Parkinson and Anna Ford and Angela Rippon, and also a man called Robert Key, who was like very senior.
He was a very great
panorama presenter and a historian. We had the chairman of the company was Peter Jay, who just stopped being the ambassador to the United States. We had a managing director was a man called Michael Deakin, whose father had been Churchill's private secretary. So it was very kind of posh place. Oh, I forgot, Jonathan Aitken was on the board, one of the people who found the money for it. As it turned out, actually illegal money, because it was Arab money in transfer. Anyway, they hadn't a clue how to run a television station, and so it was complete mayhem. They all fired each other, and I think we had something like 5 editors and 6 chairmen in the course of the first year, and it only really stabilised when Greg Dyke came along and a man called Bruce Gingell. But the point was, we, as I think I was 22 or 23. Someone had to put it on the telly on a daily basis, so we just got on. And there were other people there, like Diane Abbott was there, Jackie Ashley was there, Mark Damazer was there, because they'd had a policy of hiring people not necessarily with television experience, but who they thought had some talent.
Sounds a bit like GB News.
I don't know a lot about GB News.
Nor do I, but the impression you get is that it certainly was chaotic at the beginning. But what was it like for somebody who was 22, 23, in amongst all of these nationally known figures, and you could see the chaos that was ensuing, but presumably at that age, you couldn't really, if that was happening at Sky, you would have been the first to say, right, this has got to happen, do that. You couldn't do that at the age of 22.
I think we could, more or less.
Oh, really?
What I was going to go on to say was a great training experience, because 6 years later I went to TVM, which was properly managed, and I went to Sky, which was properly managed. But we had to, because literally we'd come into a blank sheet of paper. I mean, this is absolutely true. The day that TVM launched, and you have to remember, this was front page news.
Yeah, it was.
the day that TVM, for months, and the day TVM launched, my first shift was 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. And I came in after lunch and I said, what do you want me to do? And they said, we haven't got any celebrities for tomorrow.
This is on launch day.
This is on launch, the day before launch. So I spent the day ringing people up, like I remember ringing out Henry Cooper, the boxer, British boxer. And I said, TVAM. He said, oh, yeah, great. I love the story. I said, can you come on tomorrow? And he said, look, I'd love to, but, my diary is booked up a year, 6 months ahead. Of course, I couldn't come. And in the end, the only celebrity they could get was David Frost leaning on John Cleese to come on in his pajamas. But that was literally, we didn't have a guest booker or anything else like that. So you were inventing it. I mean, another time there was a big story, the relaunch of the Mini Metro and the Mini, basically. And I came in and I said, they said, we're going to work on the relaunch of the Mini Metro. And I said, well, what have we got? And he said, we got a film. So I looked at the film and I said, well, it's a great film, but hasn't got any pictures of the Mini Metro in it. And so I spent all afternoon and evening phoning PR people in, the Midlands and all that to get them to bike in film, which we could then translate so we'd have some pictures of it. And of course, what had happened was that the BBC had undercut the TVM launch by launching their own programme with Selena Scott and Frank Boff. And, they had, guess what, 3 Metros in the studio and all that. But that's how chaotic it was, and you just had to make the best of it. In fact, one of my favourite story of all was Diane Abbott was one of the journalists working with us. And she was also a Westminster councillor. So I think, quite wisely, she took a look at the management and decided that she would carry on with her council business. So she used to sit at the back of the office sort of doing her correspondence. And after we'd had about 4 or 5 turnovers of management, one of them decided that they would do annual reviews. So I wasn't in the room, obviously, but the story goes that Diane Abbott's called in and they say that, Diane Abbott, we're a bit disappointed with your input, bearing in mind your scholarship to Girton, your incredible record and all the rest of it. You don't really seem to have contributed as much as we were hoping for over this year. And she looked at the bloke interviewing her and said, what do you think if I have... what do you expect if I have to work for a prat like you?
Have you ever asked her if that's true? It's probably best not to. It might ruin the story. And so how did it get back on? It wasn't just Roland Rat, was it, that really dug TVM out of the mire, was it? I mean, it had to be deeper than that.
Well, the way it got back on route was twofold. I mean, Roland Rat did play a role. I've appeared on air with Roland Rat. I've interviewed Roland Rat, in fact. And indeed Peter Jay used to go round. He used to quite often come in his dinner jacket and say, "What have I got on for tomorrow?" And he said, "Have you found J. Fred Muggs yet?" And J. Fred Muggs was a chimpanzee that had launched the Today Show in America, and Roland, I suppose, was our J. Fred.
We
Muggs.
should explain for people who haven't got a clue what we're talking about. Roland Rat was a glove puppet, wasn't he?
He's still around, Roland Rat.
Is he really?
Yeah. Roland Rat. No, well, anyway, I actually had a job after I worked on the election because I understood, or vaguely understood, how outside broadcast worked. We came up to the summer, and Greg Dyke, who by then had come in, and he was one of the answers that he put the station on a more or less professional footing. He said, "Right, we've had to buy this outside broadcast truck. I'll leave out the expletives. What can we do with it now we've had the election?" He said, "Oh, no, what people like is the seaside." So he then hired Chris Tarrant to be by the seaside presenter. And Chris Tarrant at that time had just done OTT, which had not gone very well. So he was pleased for the work. And it involved And I was, because I understood outside broadcast, I was made the assistant producer. So I went around all these seaside resorts finding 5 acts a morning that we could do on the beach. And this was at the peak of Roland Rat's fame. And one of the jobs was at the end of it, the grand finale. They wanted Chris Tarrant, who had been the star of By the Seaside, in the studio with Roland Rat. So it involved a great deal of my persuading Chris Tarrant that it would be all right, it will all be okay. And he was obviously, he liked appearing with Spit the dog because Bob Carolgees was his friend, but he was a bit wary of the rat. Anyway, so finally it happens, and I managed to get Chris Tarrant in the studio with Roland Rat. And presenter does the introduction, and Roland Rat pipes out. He said, "Chris Tarrant, you haven't got any Tarrant at all." So it didn't go very well.
And it was all your fault, obviously.
It was all my fault, yeah.
I mean, what advice do you give to young producers who get jobs at the age of 22, 23 in TV nowadays? Because obviously, wherever you work in TV, it's very different to when you started. But there's always that thing where if you make yourself indispensable, you will get on. I mean, you've had producers that have come from LBC.
Yeah, sure, very good ones.
You had my producer, Jacob. And I always think it's quite interesting sort of making that transition from radio to television. But you look at all sorts of BBC programmes, Sky programmes now, and generally the producers are in their early to mid-20s, aren't they? How does the sort of cream rise to the top?
A lot of it, like success in other walks of life, is luck, is being in the right place at the right time and being given the opportunities. I think, your producers are very good because they are confident and they're self-starters. And I think, there can be quite a lot of people who throw their weight around in the media. And I think you have to have the confidence and the knowledge to make suggestions and to be able to follow through and deliver on them. And to make it work. And I think, people higher up the food chain, some actually quite often get quite lazy about, having ideas and all that. I mean, I remember working with a camera crew. I think, bizarrely, I think we were interviewing Paul Gascoigne. And, I came in with my producer, and I said, right, how are we going to do this? How are we going to set up the cameras? Where are we going to sit and all that? And, it was a freelance camera. I'd worked with a lot of people. He said, I've never had a presenter say to me, how's it going to look? Where are we going to sit? And all that. But I think that's what you need to do. But you need to do that right from the beginning to think about it in the round. Because I think the big mistake, which we're all encouraged to do in the media, and it relates to movies and drama as well, is to think it's all about the faces on the screen. And they have to deliver, but you can't do it if you're not part of a big team of support.
Right. I was remembering about 1994 when I was running a political lobbying company. We had an intern from the University of Hull. He was on Philip Norton's politics course. And he said, I really want to get into the media. What should I do? And I said, what you should go do is walk down to 4 Mill Bank and make Adam Boulton's tea. This guy, I don't know if you remember him. I think he did work at Sky, but he went on to ITV. Adam Vandermark.
I do remember, yeah.
Became editor of This Morning. And you think, all from that one conversation. And you think, well, I mean, I don't know what he did do in the end, but that's so much more difficult to do now, isn't it? To just sort of turn up and, as particularly depending on your background, if you can be an intern, but you've got to be able to finance yourself while you do it. And even unpaid internships are now frowned upon. So it's quite difficult to break in, isn't it? Much more so than 20 years ago.
I don't know. I mean, actually, I got the job at TVAM. I said it was chaotic, and I got a rejection letter and an invitation to an interview in the same post. So I ignored the rejection letter and turned up for the interview. And it transpired that actually they had 3 sacks of applications that they'd lost, and they sort of 2 years in, someone found them in the back of a cupboard. So that's what I mean by luck. I mean, companies now have a policy. I mean, I'm sure Global does, certainly Sky does, BBC does, and it's quite difficult to get internships or even interviews sometimes because they have policies on diversity that they only want people from a certain background and all that, and likewise, you know, there are quite understandable concerns about people being exploited or whatever. I mean, I've had over the years people I know or people have written to me and said, you know, can my son come in and work? And I used to be able to say, or my daughter, and I used to be able to say, yeah, come in for a few weeks, you know, if you can do it. I can't do that now. No. And I think that's a loss, but I understand why it's happening is because, you know, people feel that, you know, from people you know or people who write to you, that's somehow unfair. And then they want people from less privileged backgrounds to come in. Although, you know, some of those people are brilliant, but actually they're pretty much a mix of everything else. Some of them really don't want to be there. And, you know, wonder why they're there. So I think it's one of the, you know, the problems that we all have at the moment, you know, in wider society, that we become, for understandable reasons, much more of a rules-based society, and that does take a bit of the spontaneity and the you know, the lucky spark out of it.
How much did you get on screen in the early days of TVAM?
Well, at the very beginning, I got on screen quite a lot as a reporter. Then, when Greg Dyke came in, he brought in some sort of friends of his. There was a guy called Peter McHugh who ended up being the editor of, who was a Daily Mail journalist, you know, very sort of dead now, but a very blunt man from the Northeast. And not that he knew anything about television, but he informed me I didn't have a future on television. So I then worked for a couple of years with John Stapleton, working with him.
One of the nicest people in broadcasting.
And you know, professional to his fingertips. I mean, fantastic.
I always remember he used to, believe it or not, deputise for me on LBC when I was off on holiday or something. And at that point, I was doing a 4-hour show, 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. And he said to me one day, he said, you know, this is the most difficult thing I've ever done in broadcasting. I don't know how you do it in that last hour. I just want to fall asleep.
Well, we had actually John and his wife, the formidable Lynn Fallswood, now sadly dead, who then went on to campaign so much on bowel cancer. But they were a great, hard-working model, and I worked for them. And then a man called Bruce Gingell came in as the manager, and Gingell was, if it's not a contradiction in terms, an upper-class Australian. He'd been the first man on Australian television. He had somehow apparently launched Aboriginal television, although he was the furthest you could possibly get from being an Aboriginal. And one of the things about him was he had total contempt, as a lot of Australians do, for any type of hierarchy. And he arrived and he just looked at the people who were there and he just said, you know, I mean, Ulrika Johnson was his secretary, and he said to her, Ulrika, you're a very pretty girl. You know, why don't you do the weather? And the rest is fame. Likewise, he said to me, he said, listen, you know, he said, you can do it. You can be political editor, and that was it. And so after being banned by Peter McHugh, I was then, I think, you know, political editor by kind of 25, 26, something like that.
Was it the 83 election or 87 election where you got thumped in the stomach by Dennis Healey?
87.
Right, tell us about that.
Well, by that stage, I was political editor, and I was also doing the liaison with going to the press conferences and the liaison with the political parties, who are much more, in my opinion, open than they are now. And the way we arranged it was that Anne Diamond was, again, fantastic professional presenter, that she used to do the interviews, but I was on hand kind of at the end of the sofa, so that if it got into too much the entrails of policy, if you like, I would be able to come in and join the interview. And it was the time of the G7, which was actually happening in Venice, and Healy was the Shadow Foreign Secretary. So we had booked Dennis Healy to come on to talk about foreign policy. This is like 3 days before the election, I think. And the deal always was, we'll talk about foreign policy, but we'll talk about anything in the news. And I went out. Healy, for some reason, turned up and didn't want to come into hospitality. He said, I'll wait in the car. So I handed him and his advisor a pile of papers. We're talking like 5 a.m, which I hadn't looked at. And I then went in to Anne and I said, is all right? And she held up the front page of The Sun, which was saying that Dennis Healy's wife had had a private medical operation, and it had been an election where there'd been an awful lot about the NHS and all that. And she said, do you think it's okay to ask him about that? And I said, look, I've just told him I'll ask him about anything in the papers. You'll ask him about anything in the papers, so that's fine. And anyway, the interview happened, and Anne did a bit about, the G8 and all the rest of it. And then she just asked him absolutely straight, Mr. Healy, what is your reaction to this story? And he blew up. I mean, started bellowing about this TVM dirty tricks and all this, and stood up, still attached by the microphone, the classic kind of thing. And I could hear the director saying, cut to commercial, which was just as he was going into, and you're a, am I allowed to say shit?
You are.
Yeah, and you're a shit. You're a shit. And he turned to me as we're coming out of the studio, and he said, and you're a shit as well. And he thumped me in the chest. I was a bit taken aback by this. Do I think it was an ambush necessarily? I don't think it was an ambush. I think maybe he had prepared that he would blow up and he'd be... Anyway, the problem was normally those things that have happened off screen, everyone would try and, sweep it on the map. But coming through the studio door at that moment was the next guest, who was Nigel Dempster, who then was the absolute doyen of gossip columnists. So it was on the front page of the Standard. My picture was on the front page of the Standard. I had to hide out, and Peter Mandelson went on and banned me from Labour HQ on election night. But I have to say, it blew over. The next time I saw Dennis Healy, or the next time I interviewed him, I think next time I saw him to talk to was just after I'd gone to Sky, and we were at a by-election in South Wales, and he had come down to be the sort of daily turn for the Labour Party. And I met him in the foyer of this hotel, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Boulton, I understand you've gone to Sky News." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "They tell me you can receive it on dustbin lids," by which he meant the dishes. And that's most appropriate. But actually, after that, we got on fine again.
That is the case, though. You have a dust-up with somebody in politics, and it's almost as if it's never happened. I mean, there are some feuds that go on for years and years. But generally, people recognise that they've gone over the top, and it sort of all disappears.
Well, I mean, Healy was pretty much all over the top. I mean, he was extremely, powerful politician, former chancellor and all that. Great intellect. Also a man who had, a very, very distinguished war record as a very brave man. I mean, but, he liked to joke. I mean, literally in wintertime, you'd be on Abingdon Green waiting for him to turn up, and he would creep up behind you in the dark and go, "Grrr." Yeah. And then when you turn around, he'd got his false teeth kind of sticking out to make him look monstrous. I mean, that's the sort of person he was.
I can remember him coming into Politicos once, and he just recited a Goon sketch for no apparent reason. Yeah. It's bizarre.
But I mean, one of those, really remarkable people. And actually, it's easy to sound kind of Norman Desmond about all this, but I do look back at that period in the 80s and indeed in the 90s, and just think the sheer quality of the senior politicians on both sides is something that, certainly hasn't been matched in the last decade or so.
It's an understatement. He also wrote a brilliant memoir.
Yeah.
Really did.
Well, he was the man who put the word hinterland into common usage as to, he had lots of other hobbies. Photography was one. He was a great expert on thrillers. I mean,
and he also managed to transform himself from the most hated man in Britain, which he was when he was Chancellor, to a very sort of avuncular, popular guy.
Well, he played into his caricature because there used to be a very, very popular impressionist, before Rory Bremner, called Mike Yarwood. And Mike Yarwood latched onto Dennis Healy because he had the big bushy eyebrows. And, it was one of those things, Mike Yarwood's catchphrase was silly billies for Dennis Healy. And of course, whether Dennis Healy had ever said it before, subsequently he used it a lot because he was playing into his caricature. A bit.
Yeah.
Dare one say it, like Boris Johnson plays into his character.
Surely not. So, tell me about Sky. How did that come about?
Well, I had increasingly been involved doing politics, working with David Frost on launching what was then, the first Sunday morning, proper sort of Sunday morning chat show. There'd been Weekend World before, and also been political editor. And, I was enjoying doing what I was doing, and I'd done quite a lot of foreign work as well, and, been the first reporter at the King's Cross Fire and things like that. And Sky came along, and the first thing that happened was Kay Burley, my colleague, was recruited to Sky as a presenter. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, it's Sky and, it's Murdoch and all that. But am I a bit envious of Kay, frankly, for being approached? And in my heart of hearts, I was. And literally a few days later, I was called up. I can't remember whether it was Andrew Neil or it was the editor of Sky News, on the recommendation of Andrew Neil, who I'd got to know through Sky, saying, would you like to come and talk about being political editor? And I went, and it was all at that stage, with launcher stations, it was all in a secret building, and because I had been on television, was vaguely reconcilable, I had to sort of go in through the tradesman's entrance and all that kind of stuff. And I met this guy, John Alone, who was the first editor, Australian, but and we had a discussion, and first question I said, look, we all know what the rules are, but do you want to do this with a twist, or do you want to do it straight? And his reply was not, we're going to set up an editorial board with Lord Dacre on it or whatever. His reply was, that wouldn't work. And I had just been through the TVM strike when the technicians struck. And obviously that meant that although the politicians continued to talk to us, some of them wouldn't appear from the Labour Party because they're linked to the unions and all that. So I knew that if you were trying to run a news service to compete with ITN and BBC, you had to have access with everybody. So that was a very, very reassuring answer from John, who I'd never met before, and he was absolutely straight. And then the other thing was that he said, if you're a political editor, what do you want? And again, this, but it may sound odd, but we're talking 1989, and at that stage, facilities like the one we're talking in here didn't exist. That the BBC reporters used to have desks where they couldn't film in the House of Commons and ITV. They would then drag people outside to get on film, and then they would go back on, I suppose in the bus for the BBC and in a taxi for ITV to their headquarters, cut their piece, and possibly come back live in the evening to recite a pre-rehearsed piece of thing. But I had spent in my second university, I spent 2 years in Washington DC, and I'd worked as a stringer for a wire service, and I'd seen how the American Washington bureaus worked, given that the headquarters then were either in, well, we're all in New York. CNN came along from Atlanta a little later. And I wanted to run the political unit as a Washington bureau, effectively, even although Sky's only... And I said, look, I need editing on site, I need a crew on site, I need the ability to go live on site, and I need the ability to get interviewees live on site. And because I had been through what had happened at TVAM, in my contract, I literally had things like, you know, we'll have a phone and we'll have a fax machine and we'll have all of that, because I'd seen, you know, when the money gets tight, you know, you don't get anything. And I got all that in my personal contract. And actually, Sky was as good as that. And so we had like the first bureau here. And
weren't you in the QE2 conference?
Yeah, we were in the second basement of the QE2 conference centre, but there was a studio there, and I always took the attitude that, you know, some people at Westminster are a bit proprietorial, you know, politics, important. But I took the attitude that anyone working for Sky News who was in central London who needed facilities would go out of our way to facilitate them. So the bureau just grew and grew and grew. And then, bizarre history, this building we're talking in, number 4 Millbank, was actually, had been the the Crown Agents building. And the Crown Agents were the people who were sort of selling the fruits of the empire. And they had gone bust in a spectacular scandal in the 1970s. And this building, although it was a government building, had lain derelict. And then what happened was, the era of selling things off, a Japanese pension fund bought this building on a 999-year lease and hired a Swedish property company to say, what do you think we should do with this building now we've got it? And the Swedish property company said, what Westminster doesn't have is a media centre, because there used to be these sort of pedal your own down the line studios in Norman Shaw, the interview. And so they said, right, we will develop this building and we'll make it primarily a media centre. And the next thing they said was, well, how are we going to make that work? And they said, we'll go to the BBC and we'll make them an offer they can't refuse. So the BBC came into 4 Millbank. And I then had to go back to the editor, who was another Australian by then, but the first 3 editors were all Australian. Ian Frickberg, but had dead now, but he'd been a very distinguished correspondent for the Melbourne Age, and say to him, look, Ian, we've got to be in this building, the BBC are going to be in it, and all that. And again, you know, Sky delivered. Mm-hmm. And now we outgrew that office, and now we've got a big office on the second floor here, where outside COVID times you can have maybe 50 people working there.
Yeah. And you had some real characters working with you or working to you at that point. I mean, I always remember Judith Dawson, who I just thought had the most amazing voice for television. Real sort of Judith Dawson, Sky News.
Well, she was
very authoritative.
Well, I mean, at the time when we started, I mean, you know, as I say, I was 29, made political editor, but people were not falling over themselves to join Sky News. And initially, John Alone, this first editor, said to me, well, who do you want? You know, can you get people to work with you, kind of thing. And I knew that Richard Bestick wanted to get in television because he had written to TVAM and said, have you got any jobs in television? And at that time, I mean, this is precursor LBC. I mean, the old LBC, when they were back just off Fleet Street. And they were a very, very hard-working, sure they are still, but I mean a hard-working 24-hour news operation with very good and very determined political correspondents. So I went to Richard and I said, look, I'm setting this up. Do you want to join? And you know, Richard had a lot of experience in radio, and I'd said to John Alone initially, he said there can be 3 of you initially. And I said, well, there has to be a woman, and we need a woman. And he said, we all need a woman. And I said to Richard, you know, have you got any ideas? And he said, well, you know, I'm working with Judith Dawson, who again was a very, very experienced radio reporter, deep voice, very hardworking, slightly frightening.
Yes.
So I was political editor with 2 members of my team who were older and more experienced than I was at Westminster, and that was fantastic. And we were a unit for about seven years, and we also expanded. We then brought in the 3rd member of their team, Peter Spencer.
Talking of real characters.
The man with the pink Mercedes,
yes.
and the Voldemort dragon skin overcoat and all the rest of it. And they were big characters, but the thing about them was that they were very good at their job, and they were very determined, because although with the political parties we didn't have any problems when Sky News started, with ministries there was some snobbery that, you know, BBC and ITN, we won't do Sky. And literally all of us had at times turned up knowing that interviews were going on and had stand-up rows to get an interview, and we all had to do that. And then once you cracked one ministry, tended that, then you got the list, and then you got, and that whole process probably took about 2 or 3 years to actually make sure that you had the same access, and also at the same time, the broadcasting of the Commons was coming online. So to show that we could be trusted with the broadcast of the Commons, we did a Lords programme, which was done by very distinguished people. Owenna Griffiths, now the editor of the Today programme, she did the Lords on Sky. Karina Trimmingham, she did the Lords on Sky. So again, we were able to bring in people, but by and large, you know, HR departments of today would be horrified. It wasn't a sort of open process. It was.
And did that change?
Who you could.
That presumably changed over the years. I mean, people think the job of political editor is, well, you appear on the 10 o'clock news. I mean, in your case, you were on right throughout the day. But the job of political editor is actually to run the political department, isn't it?
Well, that's the editor bit.
Yeah,
yeah,
but people don't see that bit.
No, they don't, and to a certain extent, it's gone away again, because as political departments in television have grown at Westminster, then managers have come in, bureau managers. They wanted to get in on the act, and likewise, pretty much now, anyone who puts a package, a report on television, works with a producer, but that was not my experience. You know, the last package I did as political editor at TVM at Sky, I did not have a producer, whereas now everybody works with a producer who's getting the pictures. And I mean, I do think that, I mean, obviously, John Cole, you know, was a great national figure, and Julian Haviland was there. But I do think that the era when it was Michael Brunson, Andrew Marr, and me, that's when, if you like, the kind of cult, for good or bad, of the political editor as this really very important figure in the national conversation came out. And you know, without any false modesty, I mean, John Sargent, another person, said to me, you know, I was the guy who changed it, because I was prepared to go on live and talk about what was happening without any clearance or anything being prepared. And I mean, Sargent said to me, he said, you know, before we would talk about American politics or French politics like that, but in our own politics, we were much more cautious. But you came on and talked about what was happening at Westminster in the same way you talk about the race for the presidency or whatever, and that kind of broke that.
And do you think that was really the influence of your time in America, that you wanted to do it in not an overtly American way, but you were explaining things in a much more sort of informal way?
Yeah, I didn't know any better, honestly, and I'd obviously been influenced by what I'd seen in America, but I would say I'd also been, while I was at TVAM, I'd been allowed to have my head. I mean, I remember we were out at Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Moscow, and it was kind of one of those things. And the problem with breakfast television is what you're covering either happened yesterday or it's about to happen today. So sometimes you have to find a way of covering it, and we didn't have any. I mean, and these things used to go on much longer. I mean, a Reagan-Gorbachev summit would go on for 4 or 5 days or something. And anyway, there was one morning that was very quiet, and I just did a walk. I made a film, a sort of 5-minute film, just walking around Red Square and the Kremlin and St. Basil's and all that. Just and just literally talking, and then we put that in the film, and that was very popular. Likewise, another time, the first, big story, Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Geneva, and the first summit, and I was out there, and then we got there, all set up, and they announced a 2-day news blackout.
Just what you need.
Yeah, what could you do? And Ginjal, the Australian running TVM, he said, I want you to find the best restaurant in Geneva and do a profile of that. So I went over to the Lion d'Or on the banks of Lake Geneva and did a profile of that. So that the kind of spontaneity, if you like, was something I'd been able to do at TVM, but obviously what I wasn't able to do was necessarily, I mean, there were 1 or 2 times, like Reagan-Gorbachev having to suddenly, they went into French, and fortunately I was able to translate that. But I mean, I was able to do that actively with events as they were happening in Westminster. And then I think that other presenters, other political reporters on other channels saw that it was possible and, followed.
Did you enjoy the foreign travel aspect of the job?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've always been interested in, I suppose my first interest in political journalism was in, that's what my master's degree was in international relations. So I was always very interested in that. And having started out as a stringer in Washington, I'd always had that. I mean, going to Washington in the early 80s was fantastic because you got a visa as a student, which now allowed you to work up to 30 hours a week, up to a certain sum. And in Washington, they're always, internships and all that. And I worked for an organisation which literally was the other side of the road from my university, called the Overseas Development Council, preparing research documents, because that was just when international politicians were getting into the third world, and there was the Cancun summit. And then from doing that, there was a wire service, still exists, called Interpress, IPS, the Third World Wire. And the correspondent for that was this incredibly clever Californian lawyer called Jim Loeb, whose wife was running American Greenpeace. And he just said to me, do you want to come and string? I can't pay you. Will you do stuff? And the thing about Jim was, although he was a great, great journalist, the White House made him sick. The State Department made him sick. And he was very interested in what was happening in Central America at the time. So he used to say to me, you want to go to the White House? You go to the White House.
Right.
And this corresponded with the Falklands War. And so I remember going into the White House, into the briefing room, again, this is pre-9/11. You just had to get your name on the list, show your passport, and you could walk straight in. Now you have to be escorted all the time. And I covered the meeting between Thatcher and Reagan, and Al Haig came into the White House briefing room and started making sexual innuendo about Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and all that kind of stuff, which, of course, the journalists all loved. So, at a very early age, I got fantastic kind of access to, the very serious story, obviously. The Falklands War, yet at the time I was, seeing how they were seeing it in the United States.
What's it like when you're reporting on a prime ministerial visit to a foreign country? The facilities clearly aren't going to be what you're used to back here. You literally are almost on your own. You've got the cameraman and presumably the sound person, whatever, and it all goes wrong, and you've got nothing to fall back on. What's that experience like?
What do you mean?
Well, if the technology, clearly, if you're in a foreign country, it's going to, depending on the country, may be a little bit shaky. And you probably have done more live political reporting than any other journalist in the country ever. There must have been times when it all just went wrong.
Yeah, I mean, some of it, back in the 80s, it was extraordinary. I mean, for example, there was basically one place in all of France you could feed tape from. Which was the Rue Cognac-Jay, just next door to l'Assemblée. And, there were rules about what the post office could do. And so literally, I mean, that's my point, is that if you want to be successful in television, you also have to think about the logistics.
Yeah.
And for example, we did a tour of Jamaica with Mrs. Thatcher, and in order to do that, there wasn't anywhere in Jamaica where you should feed tape from. So we not only had to do take the camera gear and all that, and it used to be much less portable than it was now, but we actually had to take our own gear to plug in to the place in Jamaica where we could feed tapes from. And, feeding tapes used to be a great source of stress, even for TVM, but you're working overnight. I mean, I remember covering the Truro by-election after the death of David Penhaligon. This was actually for Sky. And, I had a 10 p.m. feed, and I just had to get it. And I was driving to the feed, and I drove into the back of a parked car, and I thought, oh, sod it. So I just reversed and went to do the feed. And of course, I then drove back to where this parked car was. And, there's a policeman there because you can't drive away from the scene of an accident and all that. And I had to do a breathalyzer. And I always remember doing this breathalyzer. And he said, have you had a drink? And I said, I've had one small glass of wine. And then I did the breathalyzer and it came up, and halfway through he said, it's looking good. And I thought, Christ, what does that mean? Does that mean it's looking good, he can nick me, or does it mean I'm innocent? And fortunately, he was a very nice Cornish policeman. He meant, you're okay. You can drive on, sir. Another time, I was actually detained by the police in Luxembourg, at a European summit, because, again, I was rushing to do a tape feed, and a policeman decided he wanted to question me, detain me, and I made a dismissive gesture. He claimed it was a V sign, but I'm not sure.
Could have been one finger.
Yeah. But anyway, I came out of the feeding the tape, and I was detained. And then the next thing I got was a call from the first editor of Sky, John Lane, saying, Adam, what's going on? What's going on? I'm trying to negotiate a team with RTL, and they say, you've been arrested for... Anyway, I got off on that one, but...
Have there been any politicians that have really intimidated you in interviews? And the first time you interviewed Margaret Thatcher, you must have thought, oh, my God.
Well, you certainly thought, oh, my God. But the first political editor of TVAM was a man called Andy Webb, who had been at the Press Association at PA in the great days of Chris Moncrief and and John Pienaar and David Healy and all that, but what he really wanted to be was a documentary maker, which is where he ended up. And so he said, "Oh right, we've got to interview Thatcher. I don't want to do it. You can do it." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "What's she like?" And he said, "Well, she's the sort of person that don't say 'nice day, Mrs. Thatcher,' unless you're prepared to have a discussion about the weather." And he was absolutely right. And interesting thing about Mrs. Thatcher was, again, she was someone like Bruce Gyngell, like a lot of Australians, who was completely unhierarchical. I mean, she took everyone at face value, and she engaged with your questions. And if your questions seemed to her sensible, she would answer them, and she wouldn't care that you were, spotty bloke from a television station she's not heard of before. And likewise, she was completely unimpressed by the grandees. I mean, John Cole, to the day that he retired, she used to call him Mr. Coles. And Michael Brunson, similarly, she used to call him Mr. Brunston. I mean, it just didn't figure to her that these were people, that she necessarily had to get it right. And I would say I had a good relationship with Mrs. Thatcher because I used to ask her direct questions and she used to give me direct answers. And she was, she was impressive in that way. And also someone who, I don't know whether it's, because they'd grown up in 40s, 50s, 60s, times of not so much plenty, but someone very aware of the people around. She would notice if, someone was standing and didn't have a chair, or, I remember one time we were in Texas and doing one interview after another, and I did the interview, and I had to crawl, and someone else was doing the interview, and I had to crawl along the floor below the camera to get out so I didn't spoil the show. And I was doing that, and she just stopped and looked. I said, "You look like a giant mouse." But that's what I'm saying. She was someone who responded rather than the kind of latter day ministers or whatever who all turn up with an entourage of 52 and you might hear them leaving the studio and say, "I thought that went very well, I didn't say anything." Mrs. Thatcher would have thought an interview where she didn't say anything was a waste of time.
Tell us about that rather awkward interview you had with Gordon Brown. Was it a Labour Party conference?
Yeah. Well, the problem is that although Sky News, I can genuinely say, I never had any editorial interference in the entire time that I was there. I maybe met Rupert Murdoch, I don't know, a dozen times, but he never discussed my work. He just wanted to talk about what was going on in Britain and politics and all that. Sky was an organisation basically started by Rupert Murdoch, and Sky News in particular, although he sometimes disparaged it by calling it BBC Light. Sky News continued through the hard times because of the personal support of Rupert Murdoch. And the story was, it was the party conference before the 2010 election, and there were going to be a round of interviews, again, with pooled cameras, and the fashion now is to try and do interviews in a kind of grandiose environment, operating theatre, or Boris Johnson seems to like doing the top of buildings, overlooking the New York skyline or whatever. Anyway, on this occasion, they decided that they would do these interviews in the middle of the conference hall before it started. And the night before, The Sun had made itself a story by deciding that it was going to switch from supporting New Labour, which it had done under Tony Blair, to supporting David Cameron, who was the new thing in town. And as you can understand, Gordon Brown, facing a difficult election, was not that impressed by this. And this was the famous moment when his aide apparently phoned Rebecca Wade of the Sun, and told her that they were a bunch of chumps. I'll say that very
Yes.
very,
Well,
very
well saved. There is that word I wouldn't want on the podcast. But
anyway, the next morning, I was doing an interview with Gordon Brown, and it also coincided with something quite independent of Rupert Murdoch or anything else like that, which was that I was spearheading it with John Riley, the editor, we were then pushing very hard for proper prime ministerial debates in 2010. And I think it's fair to say that Brown was in a fury because the Sun had switched. He associated Sky with Murdoch, which is understandable, although, first we knew about it was when they did it. I was pressing him because basically it was all about the approaching election. I was pressing him at that stage, which he did do, and hats off to him, to do a debate. And he said that he wanted to talk about policy matters, and I said, well, he could talk about policy matters in the debate, and he accused me of campaigning. And anyway, the interview came to an end. I said, thank you very much, Mr. Brown. And he gave me what can only be described as a Paddington Bear hard stare. And it was worse because he then started to get up to leave. And I knew that the BBC and ITV were coming after me. So I sort of said, stay there, Mr. Brown. And he got up again with his microphone on, kind of brushed past me. And the real problem with it all, again, was that because they'd chosen to do this in the public arena, there were loads of print journalists who were sort of sitting in the front row out of camera shot watching it. So it then ended up on the front page of the Standard and all the rest of it. And, the thing about Gordon Brown was that he was never a good person to interview because, you would say, well, what do the latest job figures say to you, Mr. Brown? And he'd say the fundamentals of the economy are strong. And you'd say, but actually, aren't you a bit worried about inflation? He'd say the fundamentals of the economy are strong. And then you'd say, when did you stop beating your wife? And he'd say, the fundamentals of the economy are strong. I mean, he wasn't a great interview there because unlike Thatcher...
like Theresa May.
Yeah, he didn't tend to engage. But the other thing about him was that if you could ever get him away from politics, I would say he was an exceptional. Yeah. He had a fine mind. He was interested in...
And quite funny as well.
Literature, the arts. He was very funny. But the moment it locked into Gordon Brown and his political ambitions, he became a very, very difficult person.
Talking about the 2010 election, we'll talk about the debates in a second, but the Mrs. Duffy incident, do you think Sky covered itself with glory there?
Well, I would say we weren't looking for glory, we were looking to do our job. And what you're saying is that Gordon Brown went out, requested that he had a radio microphone put on him so that we could see him meeting ordinary people and glad-handing. He met Mrs. Duffy, who raised the question of immigration with her. And then it's a bit like him walking out of the interview with me when he should have been waiting for the next person. He got into his car, still wearing his microphone, and described her as some kind of bigoted woman and berated his officials for setting him up with the walk around. And I would say that he was someone who's quite prone to blame other people when things went wrong. Anyway, so what you're saying is, should Sky have...
There must have been discussions about whether it was ethical to release that.
Should Sky have transmitted it? Was it ethical to release it? I wasn't consulted.
If you had been?
I think it was the right thing to do in the end, because I think if someone asks us to film them, then I don't think that gives them the right to choreograph what was going on. And I think it was the right thing to reveal it because it was obviously contradictory. And I don't think politicians should go around saying one thing in public and another thing in private. And you know, when he spoke to Mrs. Duffy, he kind of sympathised with her. And then he got back in the car and said she was bigoted. And I think, you know, in our job, you know, we do reveal people warts and all. And I think the public has a right to know that because I think that was pertinent.
Whoever made that decision, though, I mean, they could have affected the result of the election. Maybe they did. I don't know. But that's quite a thing to have on your shoulders, isn't it?
Well, we've had other things. I mean, it was after an interview with me that Kenneth Clarke met Malcolm Rifkind during a break and said that Theresa May was a bloody difficult woman. And he, of course, was delighted that we broadcast that subsequently.
So was she.
Yeah. I mean, I just think, you know, I think open mics for professional politicians, I think it's fair game. I mean, there have been lots of instances. There was an instance of I remember George W. Bush at a news conference, before the news conference started, saying to the person sitting next to him, see that guy? That's Adam Nagorny from the New York Times. He's a real arsehole. And then that, or asshole. And then that was broadcast. And people commented on that. I think, you know, fair enough. If it happened.
Donald Trump just did it and didn't really get it, didn't he?
Yeah. You know, I don't think one necessarily, you know, makes a great deal of it. I just think that we're out there, we're news gathering, and if someone does something that's newsworthy while you're filming them or recording them, then, you know, you put it out.
Let's talk about the debates in 2010, because I think it's fair to say without Sky, without you, they wouldn't have happened. It was a relentless campaign. Literally every ad break, there'd be some sort of strapline on the screen, and it worked. Do you think the debates themselves worked in the way that you intended them to? I mean, you hosted the first one, didn't you? Second one.
Oh, you know, it was sort of, you know, Murphy's Law that we drew it out of a hat, and actually
was Alistair Stewart
and ITV got to go first, although they'd perhaps been the most passive in the campaign for the debates. But, you know, that's the way it goes. I feel, I mean, let's go back. I had always felt, and perhaps, you know, it goes back to what we talked about the time I spent in America. I had always felt that not having debates between potential prime ministers at election time, when House of Commons is not sitting, was something in which television news was failing, that we didn't have them. And actually, going all the way back to 83 and 87, I had talked to people like Michael Dobbs and all that about whether they should take place. And one of the reasons why they never took place was because the political party that thought they had the upper hand thought, well, why risk putting ourselves on the level of our challengers? And they then tactically used to get the broadcasters to bid against each other. And then they say, well, you know, broadcasters can't make up their mind. We'll just carry on as before. But I felt increasingly that, you know, in terms of the need to give the voters the information they needed, that increasingly, even at the same time as people were saying that British politics is becoming more presidential and all that, we were actually getting less access, less direct communication from the leaders, less challenge from the leaders, because they were doing these, you know, ridiculous choreographed whistle-stop tours where basically they'd get out of a bus, they'd be surrounded by 10 officials on the bus and 3 members of the local party. and they'd repeat themselves, and then they'd say, well, that was their visit to the battleground and wherever. And I just felt we weren't getting any substance out of those things and any real knowledge of the politicians and the sort of people who were going to have as national leaders. So I just felt that it was more and more important that we should get debates happening. I also felt, and I still feel, and this is one of my rules as a television performer or presenter, is it's not about you. And I felt it was important to get debates taking place in a way that it didn't become branded BBC or branded Sky or branded ITV, that this should be like in the United States, organised, as it were, at one remove from the broadcasters, or that the broadcasters ought to agree that they would collaborate with each other doing these things as things that were publicly available. And that was something which was against the culture of both the BBC and ITV. BBC and David Dimbleby, who presented their debate, have always been clear that they wanted a produced BBC programme with their people, and they think that doing question time with one leader or another is better than having them debate. ITV was only ever interested in having exclusive. If they were going to put it on prime time, they wanted an exclusive so that they could sell advertising around it, and they didn't want anyone else to get it. That was where we were. Sky, obviously, smaller penetration, but we had the ability, because John Riley, the editor of Sky News, agreed with me, we had the ability to push it a bit, and crucially, we were prepared to say we would empty chair, that we believed that it was in the rules of Ofcom to do it, and if Gordon Brown or David Cameron didn't turn up, we were prepared to say that we would go ahead with that broadcast without the leader and not accept a surrogate. And indeed, that was one of the things privately that I agreed with Andy Coulson, who was then the media person for David Cameron. He said, are you absolutely guaranteeing that if Gordon Brown says he won't do this, you will still go ahead with the programme with David Cameron and Nick Clegg? And I was able, because I had the support of the channel, to say, yeah, that's how we would do it. So we, in that sense, we played rough. We did get the debates. As soon as we got the debates, again, I wasn't one of the producers around the table. As soon as we got the debates, our editorial team pooled managing the debate, negotiating the rules with BBC and ITN. As I said, we agreed that we'd have three. We drew lots on who would do them. BBC and Sky made them available to everybody live. ITV kept it an exclusive and made them available off. Anyway, and we also, at that stage, you might say it's an oversensitivity, but there was a great concern about, on the politicians' side, about, would it be fair? Would the broadcasters make it about them and all that? So we agreed the pages of rules and all the rest of it. And the debates took place, and all I would say is I feel the debates did all that they should have done, in as much as there's been a lot of academic research and surveys, particularly done by Leeds University for the Reuters Institute, and their survey found that people said yes, the debates had engaged them in politics, particularly younger people who, as you know, tend to be less engaged from politics. So I just felt, although what do they call it, moderating one of the debates was a technical exercise rather than being about me or me asking questions, I felt we did absolutely the job that we should be doing in broadcasting, which is better informing the public and better engaging the public in the democratic process. So on that level, I think they were a fantastic success. It is one of the regrets of my career that they didn't bed in, that we did not proceed with that model. And in my view, the election programmes, or the programmes that have been called debates that have taken place since, are not proper debates. They're much more about broadcasters polishing their own ego. They've let in the minor parties led by people who are clearly not going to be prime minister or anything else like that. I think they become, a minor part of the election campaign, where I personally think they should be a major campaign.
It's odd in a way, isn't it? Because I thought I thought there was no going back from that. Once they've been established, and yet that it has sort of gone back to what you say. Which, I mean, how you can justify as a television executive having 7 people in a debate, I do not know.
I mean, the person whose fault it was to a certain. Well, there are 2 people to blame for the model of 2010 not being repeated. One person is David Cameron, who, having done the debates, got elected, then decided that he didn't want to do any more. And I have to say, I do blame the BBC to a certain extent that they didn't like the fact that the major political event of the election was something which they didn't have ownership of, and they then, in subsequent elections, behaved in a way that they wanted the main event to be the David Dimbleby question times.
Of course, then all the coalition negotiations started, and the one thing that everybody remembers from that is your contretemps with Alistair Campbell, which you must be fed up with talking about. But I can't do a long interview with you and not ask you about it. It is. And we haven't finished yet.
Okay. That was the hung parliament after the 2010 election was a really fantastic moment to be a broadcaster, because you felt that, or I felt that people really didn't know what was going on, and that we were in a position to inform us. And we were stuck on scaffolds on Abingdon Green talking about them. And with hindsight, we were about 12 hours behind what the party negotiations were, but nonetheless, if you wanted to know what was going on, if you came to Sky News, or by then we'd been joined by the BBC, I think in the formation of the government, we were the place. And also, it was one of those times where lots and lots of people involved in the process wanted to influence what we were saying. So they were phoning us when we weren't on air and saying, you ought to know this or that's going on. And also, I was presenting it, but we also had, other reporters in other places. And as you remember, what happened was, the election was on the Thursday, and we got to the Monday evening, and the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats had been very open about what was going on, talking about what they were trying to do, even though they were having confidential negotiations. And the Labour Party, which is sort of characteristic of Gordon Brown, had just simply not said anything. And then suddenly, on Monday afternoon, Alistair Campbell appeared. Now, that Alistair Campbell hadn't stood in the election. He had had no formal job with Gordon Brown as a spokesperson or advisor. The shadow cabinet was meeting as he appeared, and he turned up, and he was going to tell us what the Labour Party was doing or make claims on behalf of the Labour Party. And I felt, first of all, that it was a bit off, frankly, for Alistair Campbell to be doing it rather than Gordon Brown or an elected person. There was also a little bit of choreography, which was I had been presenting all day, but at 5 o'clock, Jeremy Thompson took over presenting, but I stayed on as a commentator. And structurally, I think that was a mistake by Sky. We shouldn't have done that, because inevitably that meant that you had Alistair Campbell on one side claiming that Labour could form a government, even though the maths didn't justify it, and me on the other side saying you can't form. So it meant that rather than being a commentator or presenter, I was already put in the position of being an antagonist. And the other thing was, as I said, lots of people have been phoning up, and I had spoken to a number of members of, well, the outgoing cabinet who told me that the game was up, that the Rainbow Coalition would still be too short and it wouldn't hold together. They couldn't do it. And as far as I was concerned, those were people who, had been re-elected. They knew what they did. Suddenly Alistair Campbell comes up, basically trying to spin the world that, Labour could form a government. And I genuinely didn't think it was the case. And I challenged Campbell on that. But as I say, the choreography made me look like an opponent. But Alistair, who I know very well, we used to live in the same part of London, don't anymore, but, he knows my partners and my children and all the rest of it, knew that I am, perhaps he would probably say, a bit sanctimonious about partiality. I mean, I'm very proud of being impartial. So we're in this situation where I'm in an antagonist situation, in my view, have an unanswerable argument against what he's claiming. He knows me very well. So what does he do? He winds me up by attacking my integrity. I lost my temper. I shouldn't have lost my temper, but, that's what happened.
It's quite a moment. I remember it.
Yeah, but, I have to say, for about 2 years afterwards, on a daily basis, I used to have people coming up saying, you were great, what did you hit him? Including policemen. And the best one was I was walking down Haymarket and a red... on the pavement, and a red double-decker bus ground to a halt, and the bus driver led out and said, "Yeah, great, Alistair Campbell," and all that bit. And because I think people, anyway, they sympathise with me. Anyway, I felt, as we've already said, that's you have these altercations on air, and most people brush them over. Campbell actually tried to get me sacked afterwards.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously. Wrote to Sky, said I should be sacked and all that, which, although I still know him, I just think, was an example of, A, him going too far, and B, him being obsessive. But I was again, I'm grateful for it. I was backed up absolutely by Sky, by Sophie.
But you've both made your peace with each other since.
Yeah. Well, we're
but things will never be the same.
I think we have both moved on. I think Campbell was very annoyed because for some charity they wanted to do photographs of famous antagonists, and he wanted to do it with some famous sports star or something, and was told in no uncertain terms that no, the one they wanted was me. So I think he was a little bit annoyed about that.
So you finished being political editor in 2014. That must have been a big moment, because you've been doing it for, what, 25 years?
Yeah, I don't think anyone else has been in television political editor for 25 years. I had, unlike other political editors, I had also done Sunday morning programme for 17 years. I'd presented other programmes. And again, I had a conversation with the editor, John Riley, and I'd done it for 25 years. I was sort of undefeated champ, and I was ready to move on to do other things, and I think that the front line tends to be a progression in television, that you go from reporting to presenting. So I moved more into full-time presenting at that stage.
Did you enjoy that as much as you did the reporting?
Yeah, I did. I like co-presenting. I like working with other people, and particularly in the sort of grammar of television, I work mainly with women. Sarah Hewson, Darshini David, Sarah Jane Me, and I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed the mix of that. I enjoyed...
Do you think they would say the same about you? And
they were very kind.
Well, the only reason I say that is because I always think when it's a younger female presenter with a very established, big political interviewer figure, that must be quite a difficult role to play.
Well, All of them were very kind about me when I left Sky, and you can look it up on Twitter.
I believe you.
Twitter, if you don't believe it. And in fact, Isabel Webster, who's now working with Eamon on I mean, she went out of her way, and she actually described me as a true feminist. So I agree with you that, you know, you can look at the sort of drop the dead donkey caricature of, you know, the older male kind of patronising the younger Dolly Bird or whatever. That's never been my attitude, and you know, I always acknowledge that. And indeed, it was absolutely true that the women I worked with had strengths I didn't have, and vice versa. But I think if you can get a dynamic going, a personal dynamic, I think that does, you know, come across to the viewers and make it a better program. I enjoyed doing that, and I enjoyed, you know, the access of having a longer time to talk to people. And my favourite thing has always been live. So to do something live was great. You know, my only regret, to a certain extent, is that there has been, I mean, possibly because of the profusion of outlets and the growth of outlets, but access has got more and more difficult. So actually, you know, basically now cabinet ministers do the breakfast round. And if you're not on the breakfast round, you don't get to talk to cabinet ministers very often. I mean, I know. Tell
me about it.
Yeah, exactly. I know you manage occasionally, but you know, that's the truth, and that I think is a great shame.
It's got to the point now where you almost give up bidding for people because you just think, well, what's the point? They're going to say no.
Well, there's one guy who's been in the news in Downing Street who inclined to put the phone down while you're in your first sentence. So.
Can't think who you mean.
Yep.
You left. Well, we're recording this in the middle of January, near the end of January 2022. It's about a month since you finished at Sky. I was privileged to be on your final programme. You didn't betray an awful lot of emotion on that show. I was wondering how you were going to handle that, if I'm honest.
Well, you're all very kind about me. Look, I've always found compliments, you know, difficult. You don't want to crack up when people are being nice about you. I also, because I see this not as retiring but as leaving Sky, I didn't want it to make it a sort of great kind of emotional moment. But also, I mean, you know, my decision to give up was mutual, but it was pretty clear that the people now running Sky News wanted to go in a different direction, which wasn't particularly a direction that I was in sympathy with, and therefore it was, you know, it was the right time to go.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's still a lot of life in television. I think there's a lot of life in rolling news. But there's no doubt, because of the arrival of social media, you know, whereas we always used to be first with the news, we're not now first with the news, that you'll get it through your smartphone or your device or whatever. And you know, maybe they're taking the right decision, but I disagree, because I think that legacy, you know, in the media, I think legacy can last a long time. You know, we still got radio, they've got television, we still got books that we, you know. A lot of people think, well, you know, we ought to give up on the instant, the rolling news stuff, and we ought to move towards, you know, stuff online. Written pictures, packages, and all the rest of it, and that is where the investment is going in, or they tell me they want to make the investment at Sky News. I don't know. So I felt, you know, I felt a bit sad about it, but in the end, my motto has always been, I only want to work for people who want me to work for them, and obviously, if you're doing what we do, you need to feel that you've got the support and the necessary resources. And I wasn't convinced that was the case.
Which I think is a great shame, because I mean, I suppose, look, everything has to end at some point,
Yeah.
I guess. And I suppose there is a danger that we can all outlive our welcome to some extent. But it's not the same channel without you, is it? Well, I don't expect you to answer that, but it isn't.
Well, it's obviously not the same channel, and a lot of people have said that. But, I mean, you know, onward and upward. I mean, the people running Sky News now, I mean, I'm going to do a documentary for them, and I may do the odd appearance. But the odd thing is that although 33 years at Sky, I'm very much associated with Sky. I like what you said at the beginning, that I'm an insurgent. That what I've liked about being the political editor of Sky was I was the first political editor of Sky. Now we've had two.
You could take risks in a way that if you're at the BBC, you just can't, can you?
Yeah, but you see, I'm not sure you can now, and I'm looking. I don't want to be second guessed. I want people to trust me. And therefore, I'm looking for the next startup or the next fresh thing, rather than wanting to sort of be on the treadmill.
So it's not quite the same as Andrew Marr's reason for leaving the BBC when he said, "I want to discover my own voice again, or be able to say what I think." That's not what you're saying. You don't want to become a very opinionated commentator, for instance.
Absolutely not. I mean,
Because you are quite opinionated on Twitter.
Well, I don't think I am, you see.
I think you've got a very different Twitter personality to your real.
Do you? I think.
Yeah, I do.
I think it is my. I mean,
picking fights with me all the time.
I tease you, Ian. I tease people. I mean, actually, one of the sort of 2022 Adam Boulton is that I am against harumphing. It doesn't matter whether it comes from left.
Why do you think you've been doing it too much?
No, I try not to harumph, but there are people, yourself, Julie Hartley-Brewer or whatever, who occasionally...
Beg your pardon.
Occasionally harumph about things. And that's when I tend to step in and tease people because I just think, I mean, obviously you have a different past from me, and you have connections, and with the Conservative Party, I've always avoided any.
Yeah. But you don't even vote, do you?
No. Although I've had friends and indeed family, pretty involved on both sides, and that's me. I mean, I still think politics is something that they do to us, and I'm on the side of us rather than them. And I want to be like that, but I want to be questioning. I'm not interested in, that was my sort of catchphrase in my row with Alistair Campbell. Don't tell me what I think. I mean, I'm not really that interested, other than
title for your memoir
in my analysis. Well, a few others as well, but I'm not interested in my opinions. What I hope I can do is, my training, my life experience is to be able to précis and put the lines of analysis out there for other people to draw their conclusions. I just don't want people to, to think, what does Adam Boulton think? Beyond, I like cats.
Are you as addicted to politics as you always have been? I ask that because I'm not.
Do you know, if I pick up a newspaper, the political bit is not the first thing that I would read instinctively. It is the first thing I read professionally, but it's not the first thing I would read instinctively. I'm very interested in, I mean, you're interested in sport, West Ham and all that. I'm not really very interested in sport. I suppose because it's, in the end, if you follow it, you end up being partisan, really caring who wins or who scores goals or whatever.
It's a tribal thing, like politics.
Yeah,
so
well,
you're not tribal.
I'm not tribal. That's the thing. So I like things that are ambiguous. I like culture. I like
What do you think you'll be doing in a year's time?
I have your job, mate.
Well, it might be vacant. You never know.
No.
All radio presenters are very disposable.
Yeah, well, I'm only don't worry. I'm only joking. I mean, I'm still decompressing. I mean, I only stopped at Christmas.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, Andrew has sort of done his neat pivot to global. I hope that I can do a genuine portfolio in as much as work with different people doing different things. There's obviously going to be initially some continuity with Sky. I'm interested in an online site called Reaction. I'm an editorial advisor there. Lots of people have been talking to me about doing podcasts of various kinds, which I do think is a forum for discussion rather than opinion. Which attracts me.
It's a very good sort of documentary type podcast, which I think you would enjoy doing.
Yeah. So I'm going to do that, and I don't know. I mean, I would like to do some live broadcasting, but not every day. I mean, I was thinking about it. The only sort of daily grind broadcast job that seems to be vacant at the moment that would be quite fun would be BBC political editor. But I think they're probably I'm the last person that
they keep dropping out of that like flies.
I'm the last person that they would want. But that what's been great about my career so far is not being second guessed by the people in suits, and I do think that television has got more and more being second guessed by the men in suits kind of thing, and the only way you get around it is by turning yourself into a character and be full of opinions, and I'm not interested in doing that.
Adam Boulton, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been absolutely fascinating. An hour and 25 minutes. Is that the longest interview you've ever done?
It's certainly not the longest continuous time on air I've done.
No, well, we know that.
I once had to fill over an empty door waiting for Martin McGuinness to come out and shake hands with a British minister for 2 hours.
Well, been good to talk to you. Thank you very much. And join us again next week on the Iain Dale All Talk podcast. Goodbye.
Can't wait.